So, for those who are perhaps unaware, it is dramatic events that bring us together today with regard to the situation in Palestine. In the early hours of this morning, the various Palestinian liberation organizations that exist inside principally the Gaza Strip launched a widespread military operation to penetrate through the border fence that the Israelis have slung up around Gaza, turning it into the world's largest open air prison for many, many years now. For the benefit, again, of those who don't know, the situation in Gaza in its current form began with the election of the Hamas government, which took place all the way back in 2006. And this was an election that was urged on the Palestinian authorities by the Bush administration and by, of course, notorious Mr. Tony Blair, with regard to supposedly bringing legitimacy to the regime of Mahmoud Abbas. And this was supposed to usher in a Palestinian government that would be essentially wholly controlled by US imperialism, which would then sign any shoddy deal that the Israelis stuck in front of them. So that was the plan. It, of course, backfired because the regime that the Palestinian Authority that had run in Gaza for many, many years had been a completely corrupt one that had completely abandoned the national liberation struggle that had been waged formally by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the umbrella organization of Palestinian Armed Resistance Forces. And after the death of Arafat in particular, which is still contested, by the way, as to whether that was a natural death or whether it was something that was caused by the Israelis themselves. We don't know. Various theories are in existence upon that. But the regime that followed Arafat was, of course, a wholly collaborationist one run by Abbas. And so the strength of Hamas was boosted significantly because, of course, they were able to demonstrate that they were not only the ones continuing the armed resistance against the Israelis, but also they were prepared to do so and not take the American dollar to essentially become a collaborationist regime, which Fatah, headed by Abbas, was clearly prepared to do. And of course, when they won this election in Gaza, in particular, where Hamas was the strongest, the first move of the Bush administration, supported by all the Europeans, of course, was to try and cancel the elections in essence and stage a coup. This failed, and Hamas expelled and defeated the armed forces of the Palestinian Authority. And ever since then, Gaza has been turned into an open-air prison camp by the Israelis, with the full and enthusiastic support, of course, of the various American administrations that have followed. So that's from the Bush administration all the way through 8 years of Obama, through 4 years of Trump, and now into the third year of Biden. Complete consistency in their support for the imprisonment of the Palestinians in Gaza, and of course, complete support, some more, shall we say, enthusiastic, like Trump was very enthusiastic about the Israelis launching pogroms against the Palestinians, and Biden and Obama slightly less openly enthusiastic, but still backing it anyway. And what appears to have happened, according to reports from both Palestinian and Israeli sources now, is that the reason why that the Palestinian forces were able to make such dramatic gains is, at least in part, because the Israeli army had been diverted to the West Bank in order to carry out more pogroms and expulsions of Palestinians from the West Bank area. Now, why is this? This is being done because, of course, the nature of the Israeli government at the moment, and as it has been for a very long time, has become more and more nakedly reactionary. It's included forces within it, including one minister by the name of Ben-Gvir, who is a Kahanist, who is part of a movement named after the ultra-extremist rabbi Meir Kahane, And these Kahanist types are openly in favor of mass slaughter of the Palestinian population. There's a number of Kahanists in the Israeli cabinet now, and they, along with Netanyahu, have cooked up this plan to essentially wholly annex the the West Bank, and expel the Palestinian population from there. That's the plan that Netanyahu ultimately has, and he's working towards that. Of course, this meets with stiff resistance, so that's why they were obliged to bring in the Israeli army. And if you follow Palestinian resistance accounts on Telegram and in other places, you can see that they've been having a tougher and tougher job trying to impose their will in the West Bank, even with the assistance of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis have been having an increasingly difficult time trying to impose themselves. So they've been transferring more and more men and equipment to the West Bank, leaving the territory near the Gaza Strip more and more lightly defended. And the Palestinian armed forces and their intelligence networks were, of course, able to pick up on this. And so hence why they've been able to launch this offensive now. And according to the latest reports, even from, again, Israeli army sources, they've taken, depending upon who you believe, either 9 or 13 towns around the area of the Gaza Strip. They've taken several heavily armored checkpoints. They've captured at least 4 Merkava Israeli tanks, which are apparently the most advanced tanks in the world, though given how the supposedly advanced European tanks have performed in Ukraine recently, perhaps we should take that assertion with a gigantic bucket load of salt. Needless to say, they've captured an awful lot of Israeli equipment, Humvees, various armored vehicles, M113 armored personnel carriers, these Merkava tanks. They've also, by using drones equipped with droppable anti-tank weapons, and I've seen these videos going all around Telegram and other networks, they've been dropping anti-tank bombs on Israeli tanks and destroying them. So this is again like a bleed over in terms of influence from the NATO war on Russia in Ukraine, is that the Palestinians have been watching what the technology is that's been used, and they've been getting hold of it because, of course, a lot of this drone technology is actually fairly easy to assemble, and some of the world leaders in this are, of course, allied with the Palestinians, and that's, of course, the Iranian government, and they've been pushing the envelope in terms of drone designs, and, of course, learning a great deal from the performance of the drones that they have apparently been providing to the Russians, if you believe some sources, though at least they have learned a lot from how to apply them militarily. And they've been sharing that assistance with the Palestinian resistance fighters. So this is a huge event. Even if the Israelis get themselves organized and manage to take back control of these towns, it's a gigantic embarrassment for Netanyahu and his ultra-reactionary allies, and it will disgrace him and probably the policy of trying to fully annex the West Bank, if it indeed is the case that they diverted all of their forces over there and helped to enable this maneuver. The other story is that the Israeli government was planning a war, a renewed war on Gaza anyway in the next month, and the Palestinian resistance forces acted first. Now, should just emphasize that it's not just Hamas doing this. You, of course, have Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. There's a large number of Palestinian groups that in recent years, in fact over the last 10 years, from many years of being divided and fighting amongst themselves, have come together in a unified command. I think, again, the influence of the Iranians there is very important, and the influence, of course, of Hezbollah, and put themselves in a unified organization in a way that can actually act with much more effectiveness to do damage to the Israelis. And the images of Israeli soldiers being captured, including, it would seem, some very senior Israeli officers taken prisoner along with Israeli settlers, taken back to Gaza and held prisoner in attempt to, I think, bargain with the Israeli state in the end, the effect of this will be extremely damaging to Netanyahu. And it does raise some important questions about his survivability. But we've got to talk also about why the Israeli state is becoming more and more unstable. We've covered before on the live streams the degeneration of the Israeli state. I mean, the um, the settler colonial regimes are always degenerate anyway. Any regime which is based on the forcible suppression of a native population is going to produce a deeply racist and also deeply unstable regime. And the question of why the Israeli state is degenerating is a very important one to consider, because after the early 2000s and the death of Arafat, the subordination of the Fatah and the PLA, and the surrounding of Hamas in Gaza, in theory, the Israeli state should have been secure. Sharon and then Netanyahu had completed the giant border wall. They appeared to have had some success in stopping the suicide bombing campaign. So, in theory, Israel should have been secure, but it continued to politically degenerate. And that raises an interesting question as to why. And the crux of the matter is that the entire rationale for the Israeli state, not just in the last 30 years, but over the last century, has of course been the forcible suppression and expulsion of the Palestinian Arab population. Without that to unify it, the Israeli state has no rationale, it has no reason to exist. From its earliest origins, it has always been a settler colonial project and always been a particularly brutal settler colonial project. And if it's not forcibly suppressing and expelling the Palestinian population, then again, it has no reason to exist and it will fall into internal chaos and decay. And that has been proved to be the case. Even when it had apparently got the upper hand, the decay internally was significant. And we saw this manifested through military weakness, especially when it came to the 2006 war against the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon, which, if you recall, was a war that the Israelis started but couldn't finish. Now, a lot of apologists for Israel will claim, oh, we have inflicted this many casualties. We could have got all the way to Beirut, but we didn't want to. The fact is, though, that they couldn't get past the entrenched lines of defense that had been dug by Hezbollah for many years. And the skill and tenacity of the Hezbollah fighters surprised them, even blowing up Israeli tanks. Again, as Austin points out in the comments, even the best tank in the world has vulnerabilities, and Hezbollah found it in the Israeli tanks in 2006. And it would proved a big shock to the government and ultimately helped to finish off the government of Ehud Olmert. And one of the reasons why Israeli society keeps degenerating and becoming more unstable is also, of course, the waves of Zionist migration. The original migrations were mainly from Europe, and they, of course, under many different forms of influence, formed the original social democratic basis for the Israeli state in the form of the Israeli Labour Party. They then, of course, started to lose power to Menachem Begin's Likud party, and Begin was able to tap into support from the lower end of Israeli society, meaning the poorer end of the working class Israelis, who tended to be from Sephardic Jewish backgrounds, people who'd fled and been manipulated into fleeing from various different Arab countries, from everywhere from Morocco through Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Iraq. All of these places had significant Jewish populations. And the Israelis worked overtime to make sure that they fled those countries and came to Israel, where many of them, of course, the bulk of them, formed the bottom of the ladder. They were considered inferior by the Ashkenazi Jews who'd emigrated and become settlers in Israel from Europe. And it's them that the Likud party was able to tap into support from in order to propel them into a much more powerful position through the 80s, but especially into the 90s, when you got, in addition to that, the added impact of the mass migration out of the Soviet Union and out of the post-Soviet states of the Jewish population, or a significant amount of the Jewish population. Now, bear in mind also that that goes back to Israeli and CIA operations to try and secure mass migration out of the Soviet states under the claim that there was that the Soviets were engaging in anti-Semitism, which wasn't true, by the way. It was again like an intelligence operation, which the weakness and perfidiousness of the Soviet leadership allowed to succeed. And you ended up with a lot of migration to Israel going on throughout the 70s and 80s, but really takes off into the 90s. The journalist Yashir Levine actually wrote some good stuff on this, in recounting his own experience when his family left the USSR in its latter period and tried to flee to the United States. The US authorities wanted to send them to Israel. That was the default position, because Israel needs a fresh batch of settlers every few years in order for its existence to continue. They need a continued influx of settlers to push more the Palestinians off their land, to renew the Israeli state, to act as the latest wave of cannon fodder in many respects for the Israeli armed forces, and to, of course, act as voting blocks for the Israeli parties, in particular the most extreme parties, because you get the move from the Social Democrats of the Labour Party to the Likudniks, then from the Likudniks to people like Ben Gvir and various other characters who came out of the their support was built through the 90s and into the 2000s as Israeli society degenerated ever further and became ever more extreme. Because without that rationale, without the binding nature of Zionist ideology, which which is based on pushing the Palestinians out, which is based on suppression of the Arab population, without continually renewing that, the Israeli state, as I said, has no basis for its existence. But at the same time, by continually renewing that, you push Israeli bourgeois politics in a much more extreme, continually extreme direction. Because, of course, those are the only forces that can act as a renewal for the Israeli state. The Israeli so-called moderates don't exist anymore. If they do, they're very much keeping their heads down. It's the extremists who have always been in the driving seat, because ultimately they're the ones that understand that the Zionist ideology is ultimately a genocidal one. And you get people like Netanyahu who are prepared to go fully invest in that, and people like Ben Gvir who are absolutely committed to it, as was, by the way, a previous Israeli government ministers, people like Avigdor Lieberman, who I think came from, was born in the Moldovan Soviet Republic and ended up as he was a nightclub bouncer, then he ultimately became the foreign minister. He was just as extreme as Ben Gvir is now. Only the thing is, as time has gone on, the extremist parties hold more and more of the power, and they're the only ones that Netanyahu can pull together a government with. This, of course, creates problems in Israeli society, because one of the things that the liberal defenders and the leftist defenders, of which there are many still, of Israel will try and tell you is that Israel's this wonderful democratic liberal state. And in many ways they're right, because the liberal states in the world are ultimately the biggest colonialists. But it does create problems inside Israel, because the many of the pre-existing Israeli populations resent and look down upon the settler population, who in turn hate the pre-existing population ever more. And this is behind ultimately a lot of the tensions. Also, Israeli politics is, even by the admissions made in fairly mainstream Israeli publications, ruinously corrupt. Like Netanyahu alone has a myriad of corruption charges pending against him. It's completely unstable now, in that there's so many individual tiny reactionary parties who are the swing votes in the Israeli Knesset that no stable government can be formed. When they tried to put together a more liberal face on things, with Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid becoming leaders of a coalition, then That barely lasted 18 months and fell apart again. That you've got all of these attempts by Netanyahu to make the state even more dictatorial, which actually ended up causing significant problems in Israel itself. Remember those mass protests that swept Israel? A lot of it motivated by a loathing of Netanyahu. Not that this was particularly favorable towards the Palestinians either, but it points to deep divisions and growing weaknesses in Israel and a political rot that exists there that isn't going away. So again, like the reason why that Netanyahu was sending all the army units into the West Bank was because, of course, his shady deal with the Kahanists to try and ethnically cleanse the West Bank more so than it is already, creating more instability as a result. And now you're faced with a situation where the Palestinians in Gaza are able to make a very damaging breakthrough. Now, ultimately, the Israelis will mobilize every reservist that they can get their hands on and will ultimately try and launch a major incursion into Gaza itself, which brings us to, of course, the wider question in the region, ultimately involving Hezbollah, and behind them, ultimately, Iran as well, and Syria. The Hezbollah leadership has said that if there's a ground assault on Palestine, or on Gaza, then they will get involved in some way or another. Now, bear in mind, what's been going on in Lebanon over the course of the last few years is that, of course, the various imperialist powers have been maneuvering to try and freeze Hezbollah out of power, to try and damage it in some way, to try and stir up the Christian and Sunni Muslim population against Hezbollah to some degree of success. But of course, in doing so, they keep Lebanon heavily sanctioned and very, very poor. They're desperate to try and destabilize the fragile politics of Lebanon, to try and damage Hezbollah. So this is the same trick that they pull everywhere. They're more than prepared to see an entire nation go down in flames if it means that one of their opponents gets damaged. That's the standard imperialist practice. So far, it hasn't worked, though. And of course, the Israeli regime now needs to respond in a forceful manner. And if it's the case that they do so and Hezbollah acts against Israel, then that's going to, again, put an extreme amount of pressure on the Israelis. That whether they'd be able to take it or not is another question. In theory, they have hundreds of thousands of people who they can call up and stick into the army. But the internal reports of the Israeli commanders over the last 15 years have repeatedly made the case to the Israeli government that the army lacks motivation, that it often lacks discipline, that many people don't want actually to serve in it, that there is, of course, a big draft resistance movement across Israel of people who don't want to serve in the occupied territories. So the Israeli armed forces have significant problems in terms of the motivation and the morale of their own troops. And when you compare that to the motivation and the morale of the Palestinian forces or of Hezbollah, who have been fighting a shooting war either with the Israelis or Israel's allies in the jihadists in Syria for many, many years now, there's no real comparison in terms of the experience and the level of quality of the forces involved. Israel has much more high-tech weaponry, of course, has complete air supremacy, and can inflict an awful lot of damage and brutality that way. But if the Israeli internal reports about their own soldiers are right, and we see every indication that they are right, then this isn't a force that's actually capable of standing and fighting for a significant period of time, because it's suffering from an extreme internal rot that goes to a much deeper internal rot inside Israeli society itself. So this state of Israel now has significant problems, and we'd be foolish if we didn't mention at this stage the effect of the ongoing war in Ukraine, where the ultimate master of Israel, which is, of course, the United States, US imperialism, is responsible for all of the actions of the Israeli government. It doesn't matter what various apologists for US imperialism will say about them being disapproving of a particular action of Israel or not. They are directly responsible for the Israeli actions and are directly directly own Israel, and it's a project that they inherited. Excuse me, that they inherited from British imperialism. British imperialism, of course, infamously backed the Zionists before and after World War One. They specifically aimed to create a Zionist version of what they called Ulster, the occupied 6 counties of Northern Ireland, of the north of Ireland. And they aimed to create this in order specifically to give themselves an attack dog to be used against Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, and communism. And that's why the US imperialists took over the management of Israel after the middle of the 1950s. They saw its value in having this military base, essentially, in the Middle East that would be used to attack and brutalize the Arab populations and to attack the things that the United States regarded as a threat to its interests, correctly regarded as a threat to its interests, which are pan-Arab nationalism, represented by people like Nasser and the Baathists, along with pan-Arab socialism, and the ever-present threat, of course, of the Arab communist parties. And Israel was to be the military force that would be used to destroy all of these opponents of US imperialism, whilst US imperialism would appear to stand outside of the conflict in order to keep a degree of plausible deniability with regard to its own involvement in the area. Interestingly enough, there were various different points when American forces were involved directly in Israeli wars of aggression, and at certain points, the forces of the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev era fought on the side of the Arab states. And this is little known, but was apparently the case that the Soviet Air Force fought against the Israeli Air Force directly in the early 1970s. So credit to Brezhnev there for once. But the point I'm making here is, of course, that the political project that is Israel, the colonial project that is Israel, is one that is wholly controlled by US imperialism. So as a consequence of which, now US imperialism will mobilize all of the resources it can get hold of, and here's where the Ukraine question becomes relevant, to try and support the Israelis, because they've been telling the Israelis until now to send their surplus ammunition and equipment to Ukraine in order to fight the Russians. And the Palestinian military operations, as I've already said, have plainly been watching what has been going on inside Ukraine and learning from it, and also learning that for all this equipment that the Americans and the British and the French and the Germans are dumping into Ukraine isn't doing the Ukrainian forces any good. And whether the Russian government meant this to be the case or not, it is very much now becoming the case that the Ukraine war is serving as a demonstration of the old dictum from Chairman Mao when he referred to imperialism as a paper tiger that gets worn away by the wind and the rain. Imperialism can cause a lot of destruction, but again, without the masses of their own nations on their side, the imperialist ruling classes are weak. They are a colossus with feet of clay, so to speak. So the entirety of the imperialist system in the West is, of course, now swinging behind Israel. You get all of the imperialist politicians, to a man and woman, coming out full support for Netanyahu, full support for Israel. So you've got Trump banging on about how this would never have happened if he'd have been president. No, Israel has no greater friend than me. The great thing about Trump is that he's just so absolutely crude in the way he conducts himself that he gives away the game. As, by the way, did Biden used to. Biden used to back in the day as well. Remember the famous footage of Biden saying, if there was not an Israel to act in our interest in the Middle East, it would be necessary for us to create an Israel to act in our interest in the Middle East. So Biden is was almost as crude as Trump back when he was capable of coherent speech. But of course, you get the left-right division, the fake fights between the left and the right in the United States being overcome. You get Marjorie Taylor Greene and all the US right-wingers babbling on about full support for Israel, kill them all, that kind of thing. You get the same from the leaders of the Democratic Party, even though they They don't really care for Netanyahu. They think he's a bit too crude. He's a difficult sell on the doorstep. Um, Liberal Jewish opinion in the United States is very much against Netanyahu, but the Democrats are all in on this support for Israel, as are, by the way, all of the European leaders. They're all screaming about support Israel no matter what. And all of the supposedly oppositional right wingers, like the cretins like Jordan Peterson, the various like internet celebrity rightists who pretended that they were big oppositional figures because they opposed COVID lockdowns, usually from a gaming chair somewhere. And when it comes to it, though, all in with Israel. And when it comes to it, amongst all of the European politicians are all completely taking their line, of course, from the United States, from the State Department. So you get everyone from Keir Starmer to Rishi Sunak to Macron to Scholz to whichever idiot runs Austria these days, to all the yapping dogs in the Baltic. They're all on board with Israel, as is, by the way, Mr. Zelensky, the regional manager for the US empire in Kiev. He has, of course, expressed his profound sympathies for the regional manager of the US empire in Tel Aviv. Though Zelensky ought to be a little bit concerned about this, because if this goes on and turns into a regional war of some kind, then the US is going to have to make a choice between supporting Israel and supporting Ukraine. My bet is that given that Ukraine, more specifically that the Zelensky regime is already on the outs, then it will be a matter of all hands to the pump to support Israel, because that's complete consensus inside the beltway of the United States, not outside the beltway, by the way, not even amongst the US petty bourgeois right wing is that the case. But inside the beltway, complete 100% support for Israel. Biden can do anything for Israel that he likes, and the Congress will vote for it. All of the Congress, including St. Bernard of Burlington, who we now come to, who, of course, has issued a completely predictable statement condemning the violence, as has, by the way, St. Jeremy of Islington, albeit in a more mild tone. These two representatives of institutional leftism, both decrying violence, of course. Now, let's just examine that for a moment, and just how ridiculous their condemnation of violence is. Given that the Palestinian population has been subjected to over 70 years of continual armed violence by the Israeli state. Now, I know Corbyn's defenders will say, oh, well, he's in favor of peace. But what kind of peace was ever on offer to the Palestinians? Let's be clear. The whole Oslo process was a fraud, a complete fraud. What it was designed to do was to essentially shove the Palestinians into various ghettos that would be managed by a comprador figure, which is what Mahmoud Abbas is now, on behalf of US imperialism. But of course, Israel could not stand to make even those concessions. Even those concessions are too much, because to reiterate the point that we started this broadcast with, if Israel is not continually absorbing Palestinian land and pushing Palestinians off it and ethnically cleansing Palestinians, then Israel has no rationale to exist. Its entire existence is based on a mass expulsion and mass murder of the Palestinian population. If it's not doing that, then it will fall prey to all of its internal contradictions, which are myriad. And so it's stuck. It can't sign a peace deal. It can't make an accord. It can't agree to a two-state solution, because if it did, then it would collapse. That's the point. There is no peace deal to be had with this state, because the most that was ever on offer from imperialism, when it was feeling generous, was what was offered to Arafat in the late 1990s, which the Palestinian masses correctly saw as them being put in essentially a prison to be managed by essentially a regional manager appointed from Washington. And they rejected it, and that's what led to the Second Intifada. And of course, all the schemes of imperialism fell apart. And so you end up with the situation where you get people like Corbyn saying, oh, we want peace, we support peace. Well, what kind of peace? The kind of peace that was personified in the Oslo process, which was a fraud, What peace is on offer? What peace would ever be on offer from the Israeli state? The Israeli state cannot agree to a long-lasting peace deal. They cannot agree to a what the Saudis and the Qataris term a viable Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. Any Israeli government that agrees to that is fucked. They wouldn't survive. The Israeli state would implode into possible civil war if they agreed to that. So again, it is my view. Happy to hear other opinions on this. That the two-state solution is a complete non-starter. It was never going to be agreed. It can't be agreed by the Zionist regime, because if it agrees to a two-state solution, it has to give up being a settler colonial regime. It has to give up being Zionist, because unless Zionism is expanding, it is nothing. And if it falls in upon itself, then all of the violence it turns outwards will be turned inward. So it is a non-starter. What Jeremy Corbyn and the British petty bourgeois institutional left support, and what Sanders and his crew support as well, is an impossibility. What they support is a return to the illusions and the lies of the Bill Clinton era. They just want imperialism to lie better. That's all they want. And so Corbyn's mealy-mouthed, watery pacifism is as bad as Sanders' open social chauvinism in support of Israel. And somebody's put in that President Jesus says Cornel West finally issued his piss-weak statement. Precious innocents are being killed on both sides. Not a surprise. Remember, Cornel West tweeted out 12 years ago upon the death of that contemptible failed actor Ronald Reagan that Brother Reagan was, of course, a great supporter of the Soviet Jewish population when they fled the anti-Semitism of the Soviet regime. Cornel West is a rabid anti-communist as much as Ronald Reagan was. And his commitment to the downtrodden of the world is piss weak. It's almost non-existent. He supports the downtrodden, just as all of these social reformers, liberals, and Christian ministers always do. He supports the oppressed of the world as long as they're polite, as long as they're prepared to be punched in the face repeatedly or killed by their oppressor in a way that he can make moral gesticulations about, as long as they never fight back, as long as they never insist on defending themselves, then the oppressed can be represented by people like Cornel West and Jeremy Corbyn. As long as they're prepared to be continually abused and destroyed by imperialism without shooting back, then Cornel West will cry crocodile tears about their fate. As is true, by the way, for the working class population of the United States. The moment the working class population of the United States takes a militant stand on anything, the likes of Cornel West and Bernie Sanders and most of the institutional left will run a fucking mile from it. They always do. And this is the same is true of St. Jeremy of Islington and all the other rats that support people like him. They will support a cause as long as it's not difficult, as long as there's no awkward questions to be answered, as long as it doesn't get them into an awkward conversation at their next dinner party. It's what most of the institutional left are like. And therefore, it's no surprise that the people who are unequivocally supporting the right of the Palestinians to armed resistance against the Israeli state and ultimately against US imperialism, because that is who is behind all of this. Without US imperialism, and before it British imperialism, there is no Israel. There is no Israel without the US imperialists wholly backing it up, arming it, funding it, and setting it on the Palestinians and other Arab populations. And ultimately, that is who the Palestinians are fighting, which is why Jeremy Corbyn, Cornel West, Bernie Sanders, and all the other social democrats are either condemning the Palestinians or are taking the route to equivocating pacifism, because ultimately all of these people collaborate with imperialism all the time. And so it's not a surprise that they line up to varying degrees behind the ruling class when it comes to the question of, well, do you support the armed resistance of the Palestinians or not? And this leads us back to Irish Partisans' comment about Sinn Féin. Now, Sinn Féin, if you're not familiar with them, they are, of course, the party of the political wing of the provisional IRA, as was. They are, of course, one of the leading parties in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland, formerly led by Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. They look poised to, at some point soon, get enough votes to form a government in the Republic of Ireland, or the Irish Free State, if you prefer. Now, as has been commented upon many times inside the Telegram group that we run, the position of Sinn Féin on things like NATO and EU membership has been degenerating progressively since 1997. It used to be the case that Sinn Féin was an anti-imperialist party that, of course, not only supported and was active in fighting British occupation of occupied 6 counties in Ireland, but also was very much in solidarity with the Palestinians. Now, they were also anti-EU, seeing it as an imperialist entity, and anti-NATO. All of that has slipped away over the last few years. You see I believe the Sinn Féin leader is called Mary Lou MacDonald, taking a very dodgy position when it came to Ukraine. Their position becomes more and more equivocal on NATO and the EU as well. And I think Sinn Féin have become more and more pro-EU over time. So this is what happens when a formerly national liberation type movement does a deal with British imperialism and then gets a chance of power. They have already made a compromise with imperialism. They just kept on making them. And it gets to the point where, of course, they are looking at being able to win power, and therefore they say to themselves, well, we might as well cross the Rubicon. Basically prove that they are good stewards of Irish capitalism, which of course means subordinating Ireland completely, or supporting the subordination of Ireland to US imperialism. And that is what, of course, NATO represents. It's an expression of the armed force of US imperialism. And of course, it is what the European Union represents, the political and economic force which is ultimately backed up by US imperialism. And so Sinn Féin have gone down that route. And so if they've not said anything at all about the situation in Palestine, or if they've not, if they won't support the resistance of the Palestinians, then they've proven yet again that they are on a downward spiral, an uninterrupted downward spiral, towards ultimately becoming the government of the south of Ireland on behalf of US imperialism. And I'll remind you of what James Connolly said many, many years ago, which is that you could remove the British Army from Dublin Castle tomorrow and they'll still rule you. Now, you've removed the British Army from Dublin, but of course you haven't removed, the Irish ruling class didn't remove, the influence of the British intelligence agencies inside the south of Ireland, which is still very, very strong. They, of course, are committed to now, that is Sinn Féin are, the dominance of the bigger imperialist power, the dominant imperialist power, is the US. So they've delivered, they will continue to deliver Ireland into a status of being under the boot of the dominant imperialist power. You swap out the Union Jack, the old butcher's apron, for the Stars and Stripes, or in the EU flag as well. That's the trajectory that Sinn Féin are on. And so ultimately Sinn Féin will have to be removed. They'll have to be replaced as the instrument of national liberation of Ireland. And that should be coming as no surprise, because again, we go back to the very wise words of Chairman Mao when he stated, when he talked about how the struggle in China evolved. And I will read a little bit of this. It's called US Imperialism as a Paper Tiger. It's from 1956. And this is a very famous piece by Mao, but it's worth just dwelling upon a couple of things with relation to national liberation movements. So, let's see. We'll start here. everything is subject to change. The big decadent forces will give way to the small newborn forces. The small forces will change into big forces because the majority of the people demand this change. The US imperialist forces will change from big to small because the American people too are dissatisfied with their government. In my own lifetime, I myself have witnessed such changes. Some of us present were born in the Qing dynasty, and others after the 1911 revolution. The Qing dynasty was overthrown long ago. By whom? By the party of Sun Yat-sen, together with the people. Sun Yat-sen's forces were so small that the Qing officials didn't take him seriously. He led many uprisings and failed each time. In the end, however, it was Sun Yat-sen who brought down the Qing dynasty. Bigness is nothing to be afraid of. The big will be overthrown by the small. The small will become big. After overthrowing the Qing dynasty, Sun Yat-sen met his defeat, for he failed to satisfy the demands of the people, such as their demand for land and for opposition to imperialism. Nor did he understand the necessity of suppressing the counter-revolutionaries who were then moving about freely. Later, he suffered defeat at the hands of Yuan Shikai, the chieftain of the northern warlords. Yuan Shikai's forces were larger than Sun Yat-sen's, but here again this law operated. Small forces linked with the people became strong, while big forces opposed to the people became weak. Subsequently, Sun Yat-sen's bourgeois democratic revolutionaries cooperated with us communists, and together we defeated the warlord setup left behind by Yuan Shikai. Chiang Kai-shek's rule in China was recognized by the governments of all countries and lasted 22 years, and his forces were the biggest. Our forces were small, 50,000 party members at first, but only a few thousand after counter-revolutionary suppressions. The enemy made trouble everywhere. Again, this law operated. The big and strong end up in defeat because they're divorced from the people, whereas the small and weak emerge victorious because they are linked with the people and work in their interest. That's how things turned out in the end. During the anti-Japanese war, Japan was very powerful. The Kuomintang troops were driven to the hinterland, and the armed forces led by the Communist Party could only conduct guerrilla warfare in the rural areas behind the enemy lines. Japan occupied large Chinese cities such as Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan, and Canton. Nevertheless, like Germany's Hitler, the Japanese militarists collapsed in a few years in accordance with the same law. And that is, of course, what is going on here. It is what will go on with Sinn Féin in Ireland. In the end, they will perhaps get their wish. They will win control of the government of the south of Ireland. They will be the majority party in the north of Ireland. But they cannot, because of their compromises with imperialism, satisfy the demands of the masses of Ireland in a situation which economically is only getting worse. And so therefore, ultimately, when the class struggle goes through an upsurge in Ireland again, Sinn Féin will either split apart or get swept aside. Just as the forces inside occupied Palestine, such as those personified by Mahmoud Abbas, will eventually be swept aside. Just as when it comes to the development of political struggles all the way across the imperialist nations, the various different stages we go through lead us back towards the formation of mass communist parties, because each stage the masses try something out. They try out voting for a so-called populist, they try out voting for the left, they try out voting for the right. All of this turns out to be a complete dead end, and so the masses will turn towards the communists again, as long as we have done our work in properly readying ourselves for such an occasion and immersing ourselves and rooting ourselves in the masses. So I'll catch up now with the comments in the discussion group. Okay, so what have we got here? Greetings to Gillian in Bucharest. Greetings to R.T. Burgas in Germany. Hello to my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion, Peter. What have we got here? Austin says, PFLP, that's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, got increased support after the Syrian civil war, which saw Hamas side with the jihadi forces, at least rhetorically. Yeah, That was a big mistake that the Hamas leadership had to acknowledge in the end, which is that they sided with the jihadists, ultimately then having to come to the realization that the jihadists in Syria were on the side of imperialism. And they eventually reconciled with the Syrian government. But PFLP were, of course, proven to be correct about that. Banana Bender points out that Israel is scared. They should be. Their protector is weakening. Are the next 10 years vital in Israeli history, asks Lachlan. I think the next 5 years might be. I mean, they won't be able to resolve their internal contradictions without more and more aggressive outbursts against the Palestinians in the West Bank. And the more they do that, the more resistance will be generated, both inside Palestine and outside in the wider Arab population. For all that the reactionary regimes in places like Jordan and Saudi and Morocco try to normalize with the Israelis, they can't, because the Israelis, as I've said, cannot stop in their aggressive actions against the Palestinians. And as long as they carry on doing that, then even a reactionary like Mohammed bin Salman is going to be very cautious about moving forward with any normalization plan, because not only would it open up him for potential rebellion, even inside the Saudi elite, but also it would potentially destabilize the situation even further if they did so. So yes, next few years are crucial. I think in the end, the Israeli state will crumble away because it's just simply too unstable to survive. Eventually, you'll end up with some kind of a one-state solution, though I think that an awful lot of the settlers will end up turning tail and running back to the USA. So you'll end up with a huge amount of former Israelis living in various parts of the United States and Europe. And they'll be used, of course, like the reactionary Ukrainians who will ultimately flee from the defeat in Ukraine, as reserve forces of reaction for the Western Europeans and the American states as they faced increased class contradictions and class struggles inside their own countries. Right. Philbin says, during one of the last mobilizations against the embargo of Gaza, some success in mobilizing general strike in solidarity with Arabs with Israeli citizenship. Arablist party outlawed often. Chances. Well, could well be. I haven't looked enough into it to give you a clear answer on that, but there was, I remember certain general strikes did take place, and it did cause significant problems for the Israeli authorities. I need to research more as to how far that went, though. But yeah, it will have a bleed over effect into the Arab population who hold Israeli citizenship as well, inevitably so, which of course causes even more instability inside the Israeli state. Hello to Michael Hodgson. Slava says Israel is one of the few things Democrats and Republicans are not fighting about. The fighting there being in inverted commas. Yeah, when it comes to the really big priorities of US imperialism, there is no division. Absolutely no division at all. David Green says the liberal Jewish American community has basically gone silent since Trump's ascendance. It will be interesting to see how they massage these events for their own self-justification. I'm sure that some will, yes. Be interesting to see how that plays out. Here comes Cornel West's statement. Philbin's posted it. The vicious Israeli occupation and ugly Palestinian retaliation results in the killing of precious innocent people on both sides. Look, he's a prevaricating liberal. He's not in favor of the liberation of oppressed people. He's only prepared to back that if they're polite and nice and pacifistic about it. He's not on your side or anybody's side other than his own. That said, boycott, divestment and sanctions has been a social democratic cope for 2 decades, says David Green. That's very true. Ben asks, question, comrade, can you be more specific about what the mechanisms of the collapse would be within Israel if not confiscating Palestinian land? Economic crisis, class struggle due to end of distraction. Yeah, the various problems that would cause an implosion inside Israel. First of all, it would be if it wasn't continually expanding and essentially being able to drain energy from the class contradictions, then the very big class contradictions in Israel would return with a vengeance. And there are significant class contradictions inside Israel. So the class conflict would return without the expansionist ideology to continually, again, drain energy away from that. Class contradictions would return, which would be very significant inside Israel. You would end up with a lot of bitter class warfare, and the nature of the state itself would be called into question. They managed to keep this under control by, again, continually expanding into new settlements, continually rearranging the political system with support from the most extremist settler parties, continually marginalizing class struggle. Without that, without that expansionist ability, then those class contradictions in Israel would potentially explode, along with, of course, tensions between the different communities in Israel. Of course, what the Israeli ruling class would do when confronted with class struggle inside Israel itself was that if they'd been defeated and they couldn't expand anymore, they'd probably try and play up divisions between the different Jewish groups that make up the Israeli working class. So the more European elements against the Ashkenazi Jews versus the Sephardic Jews, the Jews from the Middle East versus the Jews from Europe. And you've already got a situation where it's the Ethiopian Jews who are the bottom of the ladder, the black Jews who are the bottom of the ladder there. And the Israeli ruling class would, to try and preserve its own situation, preserve its own place, manipulate all those racialist divisions inside the Israeli population itself in order to stave off a class-based revolt. So again, without the ability to displace those contradictions into expansion, the Israeli ruling class has a lot of problems, and class is at the heart of it. And to get around that, if they don't have the Palestinians to hammer, then they'd end up turning in on themselves in either class struggle or, to distract from the class struggle, going to the point where they start a civil war amongst the Israeli population itself. Israel are now bombing the tallest buildings in Gaza. The only thing they can do is essentially a 9/11. Well, it's happened before. Roddy says, once they have to do something involved, sacrifice, or even just standing up to power, the liberal left doesn't know what to do. They don't have principles, just fair weather fads. Yeah, that goes to their class origin. The trendy left, the petty bourgeois left, again, this is something which is based in the labor aristocracy and the petty bourgeoisie. Again, this is our two classes which are linked to imperialism directly, that benefit from imperialism, and of course the nature of their class position being sandwiched between capital and labor means they prevaricate by their very nature. Their politics are erratic by their very nature. Irish Partisan says, Sinn Féin have dropped their opposition to US planes based at Shannon Airport and Baldonnel Air Base near Dublin. Yeah, unfortunately not a surprise. Philbin says, beyond disappointing, one positive I've noticed in recent years is in the US is increased willingness among people in general, and I reckon Jews specifically, to speak out against Israel and support Palestinians. I think that'll continue. I don't think there's not going to be an Israeli government under this current set of relations which is not dependent upon the votes of Kahanists. And as long as that continues, the ability of anybody to defend a government based on open fascists is going to be more and more difficult. I'm sure that they could pick up some tips from the Ukrainians as to how to cover that up, though. But even there, like within the elite circles, like they can pretend that support for Nazism isn't a thing, but everybody else is seeing it now. The curtain's being very well and truly pulled down. David Green says, unfortunately, Jewish Voice for Peace is being folded into the Democratic Party, as is the fate of many petty bourgeois left organisations. They either get folded into the Democratic Party, or if they're British, they get folded into the Labour Party. Okay, Irish Partisan has put Sinn Féin's statement on the Telegram channel, okay. Philbin says, Palestinian military operation, good description. By the way, is this not an incursion or an attack, but the necessary careful defensive action of immobilized people acting for their own liberation? That is correct. Good afternoon to Zuleika. My comrade Naylor says, lots of settlers already left in the last year or so. I mean, today's events will increase those numbers significantly. Yeah, I think a lot of the smarter ones, of course, keep their passport from their home country, mainly America. So they can leg it back to the United States if things turn south. There's a lot of footage coming out of people running to the airports to quit. I hate to make these predictions, but I think that within 10 years, this version of the Israeli state won't exist anymore. I think this is it. No matter what brutalities they inflict now, this is a trajectory that they are on, and even in the medium term, they are screwed. It could happen even quicker than that. Zuleika asks, what is the best way to respond to those who use this time to attack Palestine's resistance on the basis of Palestinians being vile misogynists and Israel being a feminist haven by comparison? This is an old one, of course. By the way, this is not a new trick. The British used to do this in India. When they occupied India, they used to say things like, well, we have to stay in India because we're civilizing them. If we're not there to save Indian women from Hindu women from being chucked on funeral pyres through what's it called? The ancient practice of suti, is it? Where they would burn the deceased's wife alive with him. The British used to say, well, if not for us, look at what would happen. We are here as a civilizing influence. We are defending women. We are defending the children. We are bringing civilization. This is not a new thing. The people going around saying that the Palestinians are misogynists and Israel is this feminist and LGBTQ plus paradise. Well, it's all bullshit for a start. Imperialism, which is what Israel is a symptom of, is one of the most brutish oppressors of women and children in the world. It is the leading oppressor of women and children in the world. And it might put on this showcase every now and again, saying, oh, look at this wonderful way that Israeli women are treated. Well, there's plenty, first of all, on the most basic level, there's plenty of women, Jewish women in Israel, who are forced to cover themselves in exactly the same way that women in the majority Muslim nations are. On another level, like, what's worse exactly? The conservative and reactionary politics that you find in amongst some Muslim populations towards women, or blowing women and children up with cluster munitions, or blowing up a Palestinian school, or arresting women en masse, shooting them en masse. So what's the line here that these liberals want to draw? It's like the same argument that they used in Afghanistan. Well, we have to stay there for the women. When women were killed en masse by American bombing campaigns, by repressive actions taken by American allies, when children were raped en masse by the warlords and their creatures who the Americans were allied with. Like, Israel is one of the biggest destinations of sex-trafficked women anywhere in the world. That's not my statistic. That's a statistic that came from a book by a reactionary journalist, Misha Glenny, in his work McMafia. Israel is one of the global centers of the sex trafficking industry, and it's one of the global centers of organized crime. And so we want to talk about Israel as a great state that defends women. Again, like, if you, first of all, it's directly engaged in oppressing and brutalizing the Palestinian women. It's directly involved on a broader level in supporting the suppression and brutalization on a regional level of women. And it's at the center of the global sex trade, of the trafficking of women, of the trafficking of children. This is very well established in terms of the power of largely Eastern European, specifically Russian, organized crime institutions inside Israel that are engaged in all of this repugnant stuff. That's their home. So are you going to try and sell me Israel as the guardian of women's rights? This is a joke. Anybody who says that, by the way, I would much prefer dealing with like an open reactionary Zionist than these like mealy-mouthed liberal leftist types. The reactionary Zionist will be honest about what Israel is. It's about exerting their supremacy over the subjugated population. The liberal will wring their hands and mumble and say, well, things aren't perfect on the Arab side. Well, I'll tell you what, things will improve a hell of a lot for women in the Palestinian population when they're no longer subject to arbitrary arrest and humiliation by an occupying power. When Israel is gone, when there is a single state that runs from the river to the sea, as the phrase goes, when the occupation as the primary contradiction has been removed, I'm sure that life for women across the Palestinian nation will improve enormously because the primary oppressor is gone and the primary oppressor is Israel. So again, like this needs to be treated as the joke of an excuse as it is from people who are allergic to taking a firm stance in favor of national liberation and being able to actually defend that. This is people who want to wring their hands and get mealy-mouthed about things. Right. Okay, hello to Red Star Betty. Yes, Naila's right, which is today's actions are going to make normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel much more difficult too. Hello to Ill State Fishing, who's just chipped in $5 on the super chat there. Thank you for that. So yes, hugely momentous events taking place right now in Israel. Hello to Morgan, who's just checked in, unsettling the settlers. So to announce a couple of other things before I draw this to a close. Patreon content's going to be uploaded in the next couple of days as I'm now back from vacation. I can update the Patreon page with the episode on Plato's Republic and the episode on Russia in the 1990s. There'll be another live stream tomorrow following up on this, where I'll be talking about Putin's speech at the Valdai Club, amongst other matters, but we'll undoubtedly be coming back to this as well. So, until tomorrow when we return at 10 o'clock, I will say thank you to everybody for tuning in and contributing to what's been a very lively discussion in the chat. So that's Lachlan, Banana Bender, Irish Partisan, John Lemberger, Burke, Jerry, Slava, Philbin, Lee, Gillian, Jerry, Search and Rescue, President Jesus, Ill State Fishing, David Green, Naylor, Ben Kavanagh, Makumi, Roddy, Zuleika, Red Star Betty, Morgan. Yes, I think that's everybody. So, okay, got one more comment to deal with here. Philbin says, critique of UK movement against war, which never stopped a war, is apt, compares to recent Code Pink anti-war arrests at US Senator St. Bernard's offices, followed by disavowal of photo op by a right-wing rep. Yeah, these are people who are professional anti-war protesters who never stopped a war in their lives because it's just all about posturing and gesturing. It's not about doing anything that would threaten US imperialism's war-making ability, because that would compromise them. That would compromise their ability to act as an institutional approved opposition to US imperialism. Bear in mind, US imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism, they all have an institutional left, which is very useful because it just enables them to divert oppositional energy down dead ends. The dead end of Bernie Sanders, the dead end of Jeremy Corbyn, the dead end of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the dead end of Die Linke. All of our countries have these, and we have to see through them and move past them. Right. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'll be back again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Until then, I'll bid you adieu and keep an eye on the situation in Palestine. It's only going to get more interesting and dangerous as the situation evolves. But I'll only conclude by saying this. Free Palestine, and we must all always stand in solidarity with Palestinian resistance movements and their right to armed resistance against the aggression of US imperialism and its Israeli proxy. See you tomorrow, comrades.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours.